He'd refused to listen to the rest of the tapes after that. In fact, in a sudden fit of panic, he'd destroyed 6 of them before his senses told him to stop. The magnetic tape was in shreds, the plastic almost powdered by his screen of strength, and Andy had felt a twang of grief at the lost information. Yet he knew that this is what his elders wanted him to do. Each one of these little plastic cassettes held enough information to put the Veil at serious risk, and all of them together could tear it down completely. It was his duty as a Garou and a glasswalker to ensure that it never reached an outsider's ears, yet he couldn't bring himself to destroy the rest. The thought of knowledge not yet available to him, or maybe not even available to anyone else in the Sept, was tantalizing. He was initiated after all. He was Garou. If anyone would understand and know how to parse this information, it would be him, right? Getting up, he took out another one of the little plastic squares and popped it into the tape deck, sitting back down on his patched up leather couch and closing his eyes. As I said before, we joined the winners, and the winners were the church in this case. But before we talk about that, let's get something clear about the Middle Ages. They weren't a time of barbarism or some kind of, cultural collapse. A lot of historians and laymen think this way. It's a very human way of looking at it. But in their eyes, anyone before them was dumb, except for the Greeks, who of course were geniuses. Never mind that some of them thought that the world and everything on it was made by tiny little balls of fire and, Anyway, let's not get into thermodynamics and physics. I don't have the time or patience for that. What I was trying to get at is that humanity was busy doing stuff for this entire time as well. It was merely the fact that the relative stability of the Roman Empire was no more, so a lot more of the humans had to scramble to survive on their own, lacking much in terms of organized government. We decided to stay in Italy, of course, most of us, because that's where things were happening. Science, literature, philosophy, and so on. They all remained a staple of the Italian city-states, and the Catholic Church would turn out to be fairly adept at preserving at least some of those old Greek and Roman texts. You need to understand that at this time there was no monolithic, all-powerful Vatican who could dictate what was and wasn't accepted. I mean, they tried to do that, but with the state of things being as they were, and with the lack of means to efficiently monitor each little monastery, church, and priory around Europe, it was obviously quite easy for us and our kinfolk to get a foot in and eventually turn these pious Christians to the worship of Gaia instead. Our tribe has a lot to do with why the semi-worship of the Virgin Mary became as big as it did, in fact, although over time our use of Christian symbolism as metaphors kind of worked the other way around for us. These days, only theology students see that kind of connection, and they attribute it to local cultures getting involved. Of course, the church wasn't good or bad by any stretch of the word. That's dangerous thinking, by the way. Good or bad are usually a matter of perspective. That being said, I'd have trouble using that argument for Baines or for Maury, but then those creatures are so twisted from their original purpose. But yes, the church did horrendous things, sometimes by the guidance of us, or the leeches, but most often completely by their own volition. All in all, though, we Wardens supported the church and considered it a place of learning and safety. We made no friends doing this, I assure you. The church long preached that wolves were creatures of the devil, and the animistic faiths of Europe were snuffed out one after another by the persecution of the Christian church. And that was not appreciated by the other tribes, since that's usually where they found their human kinfolk. I mentioned our co-opting of the Virgin Mary, and maybe I should elaborate a little bit on that. We found that the Christian doctrine allowed for very little wiggle room in terms of worshipping anything but the Lord. It was monotheistic, after all. But people will always be people, and so the quasi-worship of saints sprung up like mushrooms all across the Christian world. Along with that, Mary, the Mother of God and the Perpetual Virgin, was exempt from being condemned as an idol. We used this and hid multiple layers of symbolism both in how she was depicted, but also how she was spoken of and worshipped. Young female cubs were taking vows of chastity and were taught the ways of Gaia worship right under the nose of the clergy, and they were none the wiser. We also used the opportunity these cloisters and monasteries offered by subtly influencing the construction of many of them to be closer to places of great spiritual power, forming non-urban septs around cairns for the first time in a long, long while. Many spirits we still pay service to, including Clashing Boom Boom, or likewise worshipped under the guise of angels and saints. You get the picture. Obviously, we did the same amongst the Muslims and the Jews. We were an urban tribe, first and foremost, and we had survived this far by adapting to whatever humans we happened to live with. Now, I mentioned earlier that we don't have much early evidence of our tribe, but it was around the time of the 5th century that we had the first mentions of the Wardens of Man, in a letter sent by a kinfolk and nun named Gabriele Bernini to Braccio di Danilo, who were assumed to be at least kin as well. The exact quote is, "Remember that in these times the Church is all that humanity has to tie it together. Even with the Church, Italy is barely more than a string of camps ruled by warlords who spring upon the weak with bloodlust. Without the Church, it would be nothing more. Remember that, just as they are their brother's keepers, we are still their warders, yet." Well phrased and worth remembering. Never forget that our tribe has taken the stance that it is not through extermination, but the guidance of humanity that we will be victorious. As humanity embraces the Weaver, so too must we. Eventually we may have to abandon her as well, because balance is of course more important than any of the triad. But until then, we must field whatever weapons we can against the Worm and its minions, who seek only to tear down and corrupt. There were the occasional scuffles between our camps during this time as well, mind you. There were plenty of wardens who didn't like that the Church was hoarding old documents and knowledge, and there's evidence it even turned bloody. But around the time of the Renaissance, human society had reached a point where the Church didn't need to safeguard things much more. In fact, humanity had outgrown the somewhat stifling stewardship of the Church and wanted more freedom. The Renaissance was a fervent period of creativity, almost unchecked. Naturally, we flourished during this time, as trade literally exploded, and humanity began pushing both physical and mental boundaries that had barely been tested in generations. We knew well enough where the wind was blowing, and while some of our kind remained with the Church, the Golden Wheel, which was the camp of wardens who believed more in the power of coin than faith, was having trouble keeping up with their sudden surge of power and influence. The Tetrasomians was a dominant camp in the Renaissance, even if their origin was with Frederick II's court in Palermo. They were alchemists and great thinkers who sought to revolutionize Garou society. They embraced the humanistic ideals of the Renaissance and wanted to create a Garouism as well, essentially trying to analyze and understand our nature and explain our existence, culture, and ideology. They were deeply inspired by ancient Greek philosophies, and rather quickly the Tetrasomian camp overtook almost all other camps of the Wardens, and thus our entire tribe came to be known as Tetrasomians, at least internally. You see, the other tribes, I didn't much care for it, nor did they care for our internal politics, so there are scant few documents mentioning them amongst the other Garou, and oral history being oral, words replace words, and if you ask any old Galliard from, say, the Silver Fangs or Get of Fenris, they'll say we've always been the Glasswalkers, or the Wardens, if they're particularly well read up on. To them, the great Tetrasomians, who radically changed the path of our tribe, were a fart in the wind, a passing fancy of little importance. Well, they weren't. They resemble in a sense the Orphic cults of ancient Greece, steeped in rituals and symbolism, with great inspiring leaders who truly believed in their cause. They spoke at length about balance of the soul and used ancient Greek gods to symbolize the elements of nature and of the psyche. Rational thought and action would be the savior of the Garou, as long as we did not lose sight of our goals. Naturally, not all of our tribe agreed with the Tetrasomians' ideals, because of course they wouldn't, and some of them escaped this rigid and restrictive belief system for the New World. Despite this rift, the Tetrasomians aided the colonials in fighting off England during the Revolutionary War, and this seemed to mend things at least to the point where tolerance could be, well, tolerated. Naturally, our tribe thrived during the great rapid expansions of the fledgling United States, especially once railways began to crop up. 20 Garou joined together to form the Iron Riders, and they all embraced the spirit of the time. Head west, young cub, and you will find glory. We poured all our money and resources into the expansionist dream, and it paid off in dividends. Not only did we as a tribe grow in power, the other tribes, barring the natives of course, came to rely on us for support. We were fighting with them, not against them, which I'm sure was a great change of pace for everyone involved. As for the natives, I don't blame them for the anger they hold towards us. Although, to be frank, they should have embraced our ways earlier. It would have saved them a lot of suffering. The Tetrasomians were having some issues during this time, however. The Enlightenment was a great counter-movement to the Renaissance, and the younger Garou rejected many of the core tenets of their elders. Debates often flared up into violence during this time, and as the Industrial Revolution came ever closer, things got increasingly heated. And the Industrial Revolution, with all that it brought, was clearly the beginning of the end. In Europe and America, we had let our greed blind us to the worm that had seeped into the wonders of the weaver. It had given us easy access to raw materials like oil and coal and eventually plastic, yet without the means to contain the pollution inside of these, we foolishly hastened the worm's plans. Stanem arose from this pollution, and this time he was far more powerful than in the past. For 3 full days, 20 elders stood strong against him, aided by a handful of Athros, and if legend is to be believed, a single pack of Cleophs. At the end of the battle, only 2 Garou remained, and one of them, Elia Tariko, died sinking his fangs into Stanem's eyes. And with his death, the Tetrasomians were no more, and the Iron Riders became the dominant camp of our tribe. We were still not the Glasswalkers, but that would come sooner than anyone could have imagined, for humanity wasted no time putting all of the Weavers and the Worm's gifts to use, and soon we Wardens found that our wards had outgrown and outsmarted us. The 3 grandchildren of Cain wait patiently for the time of judgment to arise. Bambi Parsons, a leader with an unbreakable will, Procyon, who has been reborn as a god amongst Cain's angels, and Dougal, whose thirst for blood is matched only by his strength of will and purpose. Their childhood, the Methuselah, control our every move through their timeless jihad. They are Her Satanic Majesty Danny, whose mere presence chills the heart, Maximilian S. Hardcastle, a tutor and master of the jihad, Socrates Johnson, a masterful craftsman of stories, Lauren Eason, a trustworthy ally and friend, Alexander Canehurst, inquisitive explorer and steward of the Canehursts, and Snow, who oversees the progress of the Council patiently from the shadows. On the Council of the Primogen are seated Edward Reed, 06, Ian Nichols, the Black Friar, Brandon Hunter Hayden, the Autumn Alchemist, and Michelle Light, wise leaders and of good judgment. This week, the Council would wish to thank the Elder Dylan William Hannay for his continued support. We deeply appreciate your wise counsel. We would also wish to thank the Ancilla Bucus Wucus, who has remained a staunch supporter through times of peace and times of trouble. Naturally, all our elders, ancillae, and neonates receive our gratitude from the bottoms of our hearts. Without your support, this would not be possible. And thank you for watching. The full moon rises, and Gaia's warriors strike out into the night. Tremble, servants of the Worm.